This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
Howdy, folks. This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to my very good friend Cristina Gomez on Shifting the Paradigm.
Hi, this is Ray Sobbs from the UnX Network, and you're listening to Shifting the Paradigm with the intrepid Cristina Gomez on the X.
You're listening to the UnX Network, KUNX-DB, Kansas City, Missouri.
Welcome to Shifting the Paradigm. I'm Cristina Gomez on the Paradigm Shifts channel and on the X, KUNX Talk Radio and affiliates, TalkStream Live and Paranormal Radio. Right here is where we look and think outside the proverbial box. We jump down those rabbit holes where you get a red Tic Tac instead of a red pill. First off, make sure you subscribe and share these shows on social media to those who you think are having their minds and eyes open to the reality that we live on a mysterious planet in a mysterious universe. All of these shows are great primers, and in the push for more clarity, transparency, and disclosure, the more voices demanding answers, the better. For those listening on KUNX Talk Radio and affiliates, I have two other shows each week, as well as The Unknown Zone every second Wednesday that only air on my YouTube channel. This Thursday is Thanksgiving and Mysteries with a History at 2:30 p.m. PST with my co-host Jimmy Church of Fade to Black Radio, and we will be covering everything related to D.B. Cooper. On Fridays at 3 p.m. PST is Weekly Strange News, where I look at all the unusual news and strange headlines from around the world. So definitely check out my website at strangeparadigms.com for all show archives, more information, and direct video links to my channel. Quick, strange news. A team of veterinary pathologists recently extracted a 5-foot-long, 1.5-meter alligator corpse from the body of an 18-foot, 5.5-meter Burmese python that was euthanized in Florida. The necropsy, or animal autopsy, was captured in a jaw-dropping video that recently went viral on Instagram. A group of biologists discovered the alligator stuffed snake in the Everglades National Park. The scientists were surveying invasive plant species when they came across the enormous serpent, which is also invasive to Florida. The researchers swiftly euthanized the snake in accordance with local wildlife guidelines and sent it to a Florida-based laboratory for necropsy. Rosie Moore, a Florida-based geoscientist who also studies invasive reptiles and amphibians, was part of the necropsy team, and she posted a video of the gory operation on her Instagram account on November 1st. In the video, the doctors cut open the snake's skin and then its stomach before sliding the dead gator out of its slimy pink tomb. It is commonly and falsely assumed that pythons and other large snakes, like anacondas, are able to swallow massive prey, such as alligators, deer, and even humans, by dislocating their jaws. But in reality, snakes' jaws do not dislocate. Instead, their upper and lower jaws are connected by a super stretchy piece of elastic tissue that gives them a great deal of mobility. Jeez, if you want to see that video and read the article, the link is in the description box below. but viewer discretion is advised. Now, my guest today is Dr. Emily Zarka. Emily earned her doctorate in literature from Arizona State University, where she currently serves as a faculty member in the English department. With expertise in the Gothic genre, horror, and monsters in literature and film, Zarka's research applies the theory that human history is monster history. She is the creator, writer, and host of the popular YouTube series Monstrum, the flagship show on PBS Storied Humanities channel. She also serves as a co-host and script editor for the Fate and Fabled series. We're going to get into all of that and more, but first, let's bring in our guest. Welcome to Shifting the Paradigm, Emily. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Oh my gosh, I am so excited for today because you have a PhD in literature within expertise in the Gothic genre, horror, and monsters in literature and film. How did you get into that? What sparked that interest for you?
I like to say that I've had a lifelong love of horror. I was fortunate enough to have a mother who was a huge fan of horror and science fiction. Some of my earliest memories are watching spooky movies with her. So she really fostered my love for those genres, and both parents have always encouraged me to read. So I've just been consuming a lot of horror from a very young age. In particular, I remember that stands out to me would be Salem's Lot and Night of the Living Dead were two of the first movies I really remember watching as a kid and thinking that there was something more going on just besides the story, although of course I was so young. They were just entertaining at the time. But after that, I started reading horror, everything from Stephen King and Richard Matheson at far too young of an age. But I always have loved horror and never really thought it was something that could become my career until I went to college, and that undergraduate work led to grad school and led to where I am now as a monster expert.
Can you explain what a monster expert is?
Absolutely. It's a term that I have come up with and given to myself, to be quite frank. I started calling myself a monster expert during my PhD program, long before I'd actually earned the title. So for me, being a monster expert means that I take a comprehensive and thorough scholarly approach to exploring how monster history is human history. So my knowledge is by no means encyclopedic. I don't know everything about every monster across the globe, but I would like to maybe one day. I mean, that's one of the best things about my job in delving into horror, folklore, and legends of all kinds is I get to research, which is one of the things I love the most to do, and really investigate different cultures in different parts of the world, in different time periods, and learn about humanity through monsters. And as a monster expert, I try to share that knowledge with everyone else out there who's willing to listen.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? How does human history, how is it incorporated with monster history? How do they work hand in hand?
So the slogan, human history is monster history, is something I came up with when I was pitching Monstrum initially. And for me, it's just a simple way of looking at the world, looking at how we have constructed our societies over time through the scary stories that we tell, with the idea that the monster, or the capital O other, that sort of frightening figure that's meant to be the outlier or so-called deviant of society, that develops some kind of negative mythology around it. Those creations, I think, really tell us what we, at that moment in time, of the person who creates the monster, the society, what they value and what they fear. Because the important thing to keep in mind with monsters and horror, it's not all just spooky stuff. They're educational and instructive in lots of ways. But to have a monster, you have to have a good guy. There has to be that other side of someone who, as I like to say, is doing the pointing and calling the other person, thing, entity as monstrous or scary in some capacity. So for me, really looking at human history through monsters, through those more negative configurations that we've come up with, is a really good way to talk about really complex ideas and topics. Because that's the thing about monsters and horror in general. I think that the best horror comes from the margins of society. And those are both the people who create it and the people who are marginalized within those stories, because they're the ones cast as the other, the deviant, the scary thing. So by looking at who's doing that finger pointing of who's coming up with those stories, I think we get to learn what those cultures value at that exact moment in time. And we see this really explicitly in some more obvious examples, but even something more vague, like a dragon that doesn't necessarily have a one particular origin point in history because it's more universal. There's usually some kind of scientific, intellectual, historical, political, artistic developments going on at that period of time that we can trace with monsters. And it's definitely more approachable in my mind to talk to people about those scary stories than trying to dive straight into the nitty-gritty and the more serious historical content.
You can hear the passion in your voice when you gave that answer. And you just touched on Monstrum. And for those that aren't familiar with it, it's an incredible YouTube series, a flagship show on PBS. So how did that all get started? What made you want to create this series? And it ended up winning multiple awards.
It's been a journey, to say the least, and I don't think that I thought the show would go as far as it has so far, and hopefully will continue to still go. But the idea for Monstrum came when I was researching my dissertation, and which focused exclusively on the undead in British Romanticism. So roughly the undead before 1850 in Gothic literature is really where my bread and butter came from. But in doing that kind of work, as a literature scholar, my approach is really comprehensive. I take a structuralist historical approach, which essentially just means that I don't think these texts are made in a vacuum. I don't think it's enough to just look at the fictional story. I think we need to look at maybe what it's trying to signal to us about the people who created it, the authors, and the society in which they were created, essentially. So while I was doing this work on the undead, I found myself diving more and more into folklore and going further back into other kinds of monsters and literally going hundreds of years outside of my technical expertise. And when I was doing that, as I'm glad you can see that I'm passionate about it. Since I've always loved horror, finding those connections was such a revelatory moment for me. And I just kept thinking, if I can have these revelations, if I can identify these threads throughout history, or even identify with a monster or a story in some capacity, other people might too. So that's one side of the equation. And the other side is I really wanted to go beyond just traditional academic learning, in terms of I didn't want to just be the professor at the head of the classroom with a couple hundred students just talking at people. I wanted to do something that was a little bit more accessible, and that did allow for some degree of sort of feedback from people all over the world. So I like to say that Monstrum is a show that teaches you about human history across the globe for people who think that they don't like to learn about history, because we use that monster approach. So while I was doing the dissertation, my alma mater, ASU, Arizona State University, gave me the opportunity to give a brief sort of TED-style talk in Washington, D.C. for the opening of one of their buildings. And I pitched this idea of the show, of essentially me focusing on one monster and really trying to explain why it exists, to make those connections between people, essentially. And I think that's what I hope my work ultimately does, is show that we have more in common as humans than we have differences. So that unifying factor. And I was given the opportunity to cold pitch PBS the idea for the show, this idea that I wanted to do that deep scholarship, use, the skills that I have as a trained academic, but make something still that's fun and approachable. I knew I wanted original illustrations, and I knew I didn't just want to focus on the most popular monsters. And with sort of those missions in mind, PBS happily gave me the chance to do one episode, and one turned into 5, which turned into what will be our 5th season of Monstrum in 2023. So it's been an incredible journey, and one I'm very fortunate for. But essentially, Monstrum just came from me being a complete nerd for horror and coming with love to teach and wanting to unite those two things.
Oh my gosh. And I would like to mention, for those that haven't seen it, please go watch it. It blows your mind. It's so well done, but it's entertaining, but also incredibly educational. So I feel like you hit them all out of the ballpark with your goals, and you accomplished all of those, at least in my opinion.
Well, thank you. That's always nice to hear.
So when did the Gothic and horror genre flourish in literature to where it is today?
So, like most things, I do want to say that this idea of genre in literature is something that I do like to push against. I think that those labels can be both helpful and also not serve our purposes. But for the sake of this, and in general, I would say that Gothic literature as a genre emerged alongside or in conjunction with the British Romantic period. So essentially the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and not just in Britain, in places like France and Germany, we see this rise in literature that fiction evoking terror or horror in some kind of remote picturesque setting with supernatural, uncanny, or macabre elements. And oftentimes there's sort of this idea that is something supernatural happening or is there a more normal explanation? And I think that it's important to understand that that Gothic genre did so well in the late 18th and early 19th century because for me, the Gothic is about transgression as much as it is about horror. This idea that we can challenge the boundaries that define our society while also offering solutions for alternative ideas within those boundaries. And this becomes particularly relevant in that time period, in the Romantic period, because there were so many different kinds of revolution across the globe. So from everything like slave revolts to the French Revolution to pushing back against the Enlightenment. So we have this real merging of history and science and art and intellectual sort of confrontation that was happening during that time. And authors decided to investigate those different kinds of thought, and essentially the bodies and the ideas held within them were scrutinized as concepts of agency took on greater meaning. So it's hard to sometimes separate the Gothic from horror because they definitely overlap. In general, if I had to make a distinction, I would say that it comes down to horror usually is more visceral. It's meant to scare and disgust maybe before it's meant to do something else, where I think that the Gothic is less about a direct fear or threat and more of this romantic idea of Edmund Burke's delight. So essentially confronting terror through a lens. And I think that both Gothic and horror can serve as that sort of lens where essentially we get to confront scary ideas and scary topics without actually being in danger ourselves. And I think that looking at the Gothic genre and everything that's emerged from there, we see it actually happening right now, is that in times of crisis, we have an increase in both the production of Gothic and horror texts and the desire of audiences to engage with those kind of texts. Because I think that talking about horror and the Gothic and reading those stories, watching those movies, listening to those podcasts, what have you, all of those confrontations become intellectual and emotional exercises. Or as an easier way to say it, when there's scary stuff happening in the world, that's reflected in literature and in creative work. And in turn, we can identify with those texts in some capacity because of the real horrors going on in the world around us.
You've covered many terrifying creatures and cryptids on Monstrum, one of them being El Silbón, or the whistler that lurks in South America. Can you tell us the story?
Sure. So El Silbón is a tall, emaciated, malevolent ghost who wears a particular style of hat that is relevant to sort of the ranchers of that area, which is part of its story, which I'll get to. But essentially, the ghost there's different variations of the legend, as there are with all good folklore and all good monsters. But essentially, it's the belief that a young man was cursed by his grandfather for killing his own father. So essentially, it was a retribution for patricide. And this these stories started in the Los Llanos area of South America, and El Silbón, he wanders the plains looking particularly for partiers, for drunks and womanizers. And the reasons behind that are multiple. Part of it is in his origin story. So again, there's different variations of his origin story, but in some variations, he kills his dad because he's just a spoiled child who doesn't get the food that he wants. In others, it's revenge because his father seduced his wife or assaulted her, or even that his father murdered the daughter-in-law because she was maybe sexually promiscuous. And regardless, there's one thing that people do agree on, is that that young man's grandfather, wanted to punish his grandson for killing his dad. So he tortured him with a whip and then washed his wounds with a particular kind of alcohol and released him to some hungry and rabid dogs. And that's what killed him, which is brutal in so many different ways. But I think is really fascinating about that story, again, is what it teaches us about the people of that area. Because in the 19th century, where stories of El Silbón really took root, at least the ones we have that are recorded, that was the same time that predominantly that area of South America was cattle ranching. And particularly the cattle population became larger and more vibrant in many ways because of Spanish influence. So we have these more indigenous peoples who are more local to the area, those ranchers. They were skilled horsemen and fighters, and they were conscripted in many ways, and sometimes forced by the Spanish crown to work for them. And with that sort of interaction happening, we have more recordings essentially of these stories. But I think it's really interesting that El Silbón, I think, helps us remember that those cattle ranchers did serve a really important purpose. Again, El Silbón is a scary ghost monster, but he wears a cattle rancher hat. He, goes after those drunks and those womanizers. He's traveling across the plains. So I think that by engaging with monsters like El Silbón, we're forced to look at the larger history to try to understand why that particular monster came about.
And he also has a rather big bag. What's in that?
He does. The bag is full of bones. So those bones, you might be able to hear. You always hear El Silbón before you actually see him. And usually this is from the bag rattling with the bones, or it could also be his whistle. That's really what he's known for, is this eerie whistle. And again, that whistle, actually, the farther away it is, the closer he is. So it's, I think, interesting, again, to think about if it's nighttime, you're walking home late at night, maybe after having a few drinks, and you hear a strange sound or you hear this whistle, this story comes to mind and you become even more scared. And that just capitalizes on natural fears we have of things like darkness and loneliness, among other things. But the fact that El Silbón goes after those womanizers and drunks clearly serves a social lesson as well, right? It's meant to, in some ways, encourage people to not engage in those activities so they won't be at risk for El Silbón. But yeah, that bag is full of the bones of his victims, because if he doesn't, he usually kills people. But if El Silbón does not do that, he's at least going to be a little trickster and sort of mess with your mind. So at the very least, that monster is going to try to scare the wits out of you. And at worst, he's literally going to suck the alcohol out of your body very viscerally and kill you.
Look at this face. That is pretty scary. Now, I've actually never heard of this story, and so I had to ask you about it, because even though I have roots in South America, I was never told this story as a child. So for me, I'm just like, I want to know more about this one. And what's really interesting about this one in particular that you made mention in that episode was that if you hear the whistle, you're practically already done for, and you're going to hear it before you see him.
That's right. Yeah, which is, again, so creepy. But I'm really glad, again, that you had the same reaction that, again, all my research comes from, which is this desire of, I come across a story that I haven't heard before. And that's one of the things I really love about having Monstrum be so accessible on YouTube and on PBS, is that if you have an internet connection, you get a chance to hear these stories. And at least maybe that sparks an interest of your own and does, have you go back and maybe ask some of your relatives or friends if they've heard the story. Maybe it makes you do some research on your own. But I think that the idea that monsters can actually root us to our shared past and to our personal past from whatever cultures and communities we belong to is something really powerful. And I love seeing in the comments on the YouTube channel where someone might be like you and say, oh, I've never heard of this. I can't wait to learn more. Or the opposite with like, I grew up with this story and here's the variation I've heard, or here's an additional piece of folklore that we can add. And I just love that sort of community engagement. And I think ultimately, whatever you call spooky stories, if you want to look at them as folklore or horror or Gothic or what have you, there is a community element. And I think part of that comes naturally from storytelling, but part of that comes from the give and take that we have with something that's meant to scare us. When we have that emotional reaction or connection, I think that that makes those stories even more impactful.
You're absolutely right. Now, it is a skill to be a storyteller. Not everyone has it, and I'm one of those people. I do not have the storytelling skills. So when I hear a good story, I mean, I am full in. I am fully engaged in that story. Now, we have just a few minutes left before we get to the break. So my next question to you is, have you come across a similar story to El Sibon in other parts of the world from your research?
Mm-hmm. I actually haven't. And I think, again, that's really distinctive of the region and the peoples from which the story comes from, that it shows really specifically that some monsters are for certain communities. So to my knowledge, there is no other ghost that has the same appearance that's also a ghost, that has that sort of punishment, curse, and who also is wearing that cattle rancher hat with the whistling, of course. So there are other monsters who might whistle. There are other very, tall, emaciated figures that are threats. But there's that unique combination of elements speaks so beautifully to the particular region in which that monster story comes from. And again, I think that there can be connections to other kinds of monsters, but those really specific little details just prove, in my mind, that these stories have meaning because they tell us something specifically about those cultures.
Emily, first off, thank you so much for giving that explanation. Now, we are coming towards a break. We will be right back.
Gigawatt paranormal powerhouse, KUNX-DB, The X.
This is Micah Hanks of the Micah Hanks program right here on KUNX. And right now, you're having your paradigm shifted by the one and only Cristina Gomez.
Your new source for alternative talk radio on the internet. The X.
Howdy, folks. This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to my very good friend Cristina Gomez on Shifting the Paradigm.
Do you have an interest in the paranormal? Then you'll love the unxnetwork.com. The X is your streaming audio and video for everything supernatural, strange, and mysterious, like UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, and so much more. From hosts like Jimmy Church, Whitley Strieber, Micah Hanks, and Cristina Gomez. Visit the unxnetwork.com show page for a complete list of all the paranormal programs you'll find on the X. Be sure to follow us on Twitter for updates at KUNXDB. Follow our Facebook group, UnX Network. Find the podcast on Spotify, iHeart, Audible, and Apple Podcast. It's time. It's new. It's the X.
So, you love talk radio? Then you'll love TalkStreamLive.com. TalkStream Live is always on, 24/7 with the best streaming talk shows. Find your favorite talkers and discover some new ones. It's free, readily available online or on mobile with any smartphone or tablet. Finding your favorite talk shows all in one place has gotten a whole lot easier. Just go to TalkStreamLive.com. Be sure to download the free apps from Google Play or the iTunes App Store.
Explaining the unexplained. The new unxnetwork.com.
Hi, this is Race Hobbs, head of programming at the new UnX Network, and you're locked on Shifting the Paradigm with the intrepid Cristina Gomez on the X.
This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
I'm gonna chase it, and I'm gonna chase it. I know we can't ignore it, no matter how hard we try. And I'm gonna chase it, and I'm gonna chase it. I know we can't ignore it, no matter how hard we try. Fire in the veins, I fight to gain, breaking all the rules to keep me sane.
Welcome back. With me today is Dr. Emily Zarka. You wrote and hosted the Telly award-winning documentary special Exhumed, a history of zombies that aired nationally on PBS in October of 2020. What is the human fascination with zombies? Why can we watch movie after movie about these guys?
I think that's a two-pronged answer in a couple ways. I think that part of the fascination with zombies is, in general, a larger fascination with the undead. So not just with the flesh-eating or, soul-stolen reanimated corpse, but with reanimated corpses of all kinds. In my research so far, I've found that every society or culture that buries their dead also has some kind of reanimated corpse narrative or story, some spooky monster that could potentially come from those deaths, basically. So I think on one hand, it speaks more largely to ideas that we have about death and a fear of it because it is unknown. And there's something really scary, I think, but potentially rewarding also if the undead can come back and speak to us. I mean, that's what we hope, right? They're going to speak to us and not try to eat us. But the other part of that fascination, I really think, comes even if people don't understand the origins of the zombie, Z-O-M-B-I and Z-O-M-B-I-E. I think that the complex narratives, again, in history of the zombie makes it so appealing. And by that, I mean that the zombie only exists because of slavery, which is a truth that some people don't want to confront, but is integral to the story. And essentially, the zombie, Z-O-M-B-I, emerged in Haiti with the enslaved Africans who were forced there. And they came from, obviously, a very wide range of different spiritual and religious practices and cultural beliefs, and forced together under slavery, they developed a new religion and a new sort of monster, the zombie, which was really about, at the beginning, nothing to do with flesh or brain eating. Those are all modern constructions that we have to thank for that. And it was more about this idea of being enslaved after death by a member of your own community. That was really threatening. But again, I think the undead in so many ways are fascinating. And I think that in terms of the popularity of zombie books and comics and TV shows and movies today, we have a lot to thank pop culture for that. And the public media is we have these benchmark sort of films or books or shows that emerge, again, very similarly like what I was saying with the Gothic literature, emerge at times of cultural conflict or crisis. And the reanimated corpse is a really interesting way to connect those moments and challenge them, because unlike other monsters, even unlike something like El Sabon, right, who is that punished, skinny, scary ghost figure who carries bones in the bag, that seems more separate from what could really happen. Whereas undead bodies like the zombie, those people were once alive. That could be us. And I think that very thin veil between life and death, between us and them, between human and monster, is something that is a pretty universal language that we all can relate to in some capacity, even if it does scare us. So again, I think that the zombie fascination comes both with a larger cultural or human actually desire to understand death and a fear of it with the undead body, but also because of how politically charged the zombie is, intentional or not. We cannot talk about zombies without talking about that really complex social history.
Can you go into that a little bit more, that political aspect or that more kind of social aspect? How is that incorporated with zombies?
So as I said before, the original zombie, ZOMBI, comes actually from the practice of Vodou, which emerged again in Haiti during the 17th and 18th centuries, primarily with enslaved Africans in that island. And what actually happened is the Haitian Revolution forced, rightfully so, in many ways. There are a lot of the slave owners, so plantation owners and those folks, as well as some freed Africans as well, moved from Haiti to the United States, to places like Louisiana and New Orleans, where the environments were similar to engage with the kinds of trades they were already part of. And so with, again, more people coming to an already existing culture, we see Vodou also become a separate religion called Voodoo. And when you have bodies and communities and peoples of different kinds, there's obviously going to be tension there already. And then, of course, you have the racial tension that's going on as well. And we see this reflected in the 20th century when the U.S. occupied Haiti and, decided to try to demonize some of the non-white people who were there. And we see both military members and journalists start recording these extremely exaggerated accounts of Vodou rituals, with, of course, some things that are true, but most of it exaggerated, fabricated, meant to demonize those people. So we hear the stories of the zombie appear more frequently in the English language at the very least, and it starts to spread. And what also was happening during that time, besides all the political tension, was the emergence of Hollywood. So we see the zombie start appearing in movies, and that kind of doesn't go away. It ebbs and flows and peaks, a lot of people would say, myself included, with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which of course famously has a very obvious racial tension going on within it as well. The Black survivor is shot by a militia essentially at the end of the film after surviving the zombies. And when the civil rights movement was happening, when that movie was released, it's hard not to see how that movie can be read politically. And throughout zombie movies, we actually see other spikes as well in different types of zombies that emerge. So for me, the zombie is always political because it has that direct connection to slavery. But I think it's important also to note, and I learned this when I was interviewing various experts and Vodou and Voodoo priestesses and different community members, that the zombie is also about resistance, that there is something very powerful, at least initially in its creation, that those enslaved peoples were really trying to preserve community and hold on to some of their traditions in some ways. So the zombified body is as much transgressive as it can be repressive.
Usually when you watch a zombie movie, you would not even consider those other aspects. And it's not something that I could have even imagined. Now, you mentioned Vodou and voodoo. What's the difference between the two?
So essentially the difference between the two is that Vodou, again, was Vodou, was the first spiritual practice that emerged primarily in Haiti, again, from those West African beliefs. But when we see Vodou move to the US and again encounter different kinds of people, including indigenous communities that were in Louisiana and parts around it, that were, you know, some of the other communities and peoples at the time, we have this merging more and more of different kinds of religious ideas. So I'm not the best person to probably explain the difference between Vodou and voodoo, but essentially part of it's about location and part of it's about also the different spiritual practices within that reflect the different communities that sort of took hold of those different ideas. But basically it's two religions that are still very alive and vibrant today, that are practiced and respected by many people. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about Vodou and voodoo and zombies. Although both religions believe in zombies, I was told by Vodou and voodoo practitioners alike when I was filming Exhumed that the zombie is something that very much exists to them. It is not anywhere close to zombies that we see in popular media today. Again, the zombie is about stealing the soul and having control over another person. Whereas I think the zombie that we see today is a completely different set of fears. So again, different kinds of zombies and just different ways of thinking about the world, I guess.
We're going to talk about a bunch of other entities that you've covered from around the globe, but out of all of them, which ones do you believe to be real?
Ooh, that is a hard question. One thing I will say is that my research, I'm not a ghost hunter. I'm not a cryptozoologist. I'm not necessarily looking to prove if these things exist or don't exist. I personally am more intrigued by the stories that surround them and by the idea of why people want to believe. I think for me, that's more compelling. If I had to say something that could exist, I believe in ghosts and life after death in some ways in terms of that spiritual, at least energy. So that's one thing for me. If we're talking more about cryptids or like physical monsters, I would probably have to say the Kraken, only because giant squid do exist and they are terrifying. And in my research, I learned that the samples that we have of giant squid over human history are likely the smaller, weaker ones of the species. So for all I know, there is a massive giant squid lurking somewhere in the ocean, and it would terrify me because I actually think Kraken are very scary.
And very quickly, for those that aren't familiar with the Kraken, can you just give us a brief overview of what they are?
Yeah, of course. So the Kraken is essentially one of the most notorious sea creatures. It is a tentacled monster from the deep. So think giant octopus or giant squid. And when I say that, I mean not like a couple feet, like hundreds, if not thousands of feet long. A lot of the time the Kraken were described as pulling down ships, as, you know, eating sailors. They always have the tentacles with the suckers and maybe even fangs, which again, giant squid actually can have those things or do have those things, which is terrifying. So yeah, just think of the Kraken as a notorious sea beast from pretty much across the globe that looks like a really, really, really big giant squid.
There was one comment I read a while back on a video relating to the ocean, and it stuck with me. And the comment said, the ocean is just like a monster soup. It is just terrifying there. And
that is so true.
Yeah. And that one, I'm just like, I'm going to keep that quote forever in here because personally, I am terrified of drowning. I don't mind the ocean. I like seafood, but like, I don't think I would just casually want to go into the middle of the ocean just for fun.
Definitely. And that's what I think is, I mean, the uniting thread across all kinds of sea monsters, that you're absolutely right. There's all different kinds of scary, threatening creatures that we have stories of that live in the water. And some of them are real. Of course, there are dangerous animals in the ocean, things like killer whales. Sharks is notorious, but not necessarily correct. But there are scary things about the ocean. And like you said, drowning is one of them. Also running aground, whirlpools, all those kind of crazy things that can happen that have natural causes are scary enough. And again, I think that a lot of the time sea monsters come particularly from a fear of that unknown element, is that we've been sailing across the seas for a very long time as humans. And how do we explain when an entire ship goes missing, or if a particular individual is drowning and maybe there's blood around them and you can't actually see what's causing that? We fill in the gap with a story, and usually with a monster.
And to my understanding, only about 20% of our Earth's oceans are kind of mapped out and understood. That 80% is in that unknown, and we have no idea what kind of monsters live there.
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, both terrifying and also inspiring, which is one of the other great things about monsters, is it's not just about frightening people, and it's not just about the actual literal threats that might inspire. Excuse me, I just used inspire twice. It's not about those actual threats, but about maybe what our imaginations can fill in. And I think that that's really where we as humans and storytellers shine, is when we do try to fill in the gaps. And there can be some negative interpretations of those gaps, of course, but I think monsters are just such a fruitful way of looking at the world. What scares us, and then why? And monsters come from the why.
Here on this channel, we are very interested in the Wendigo or Windigo, as is your community, because your show on the topic is one of the most viewed videos on Monstrum. Now, for those that are not familiar with this entity, can you tell us about it?
Sure. So the Wendigo is a malevolent monster that appears only during winter in the lore of the peoples of the Algonquian language family, so North American origins here. There are many, many different stories about the creature. There are many, many names of the creature as well. So more commonly, I feel like it's called the Wendigo. But I go with the Wendigo pronunciation and spelling because I think that's closer to some of the original indigenous sources. But it's hard to give a single definition of the creature, not only because of so many stories exist and all those different names, but broadly, the Wendigo is a giant, emaciated humanoid figure with large teeth and claws, and they're defined by their appetite for human flesh. So unlike another tall, emaciated figure like El Cibon, the Wendigo specifically is connected to winter and that idea of flesh eating. Human flesh. And I think that the Wendigo represents the dangers of not only real potential for cannibalism, but selfishness. So in some cases, in stories, the Wendigo usually becomes a Wendigo as a human who becomes a Wendigo after eating human flesh. But sometimes it's just because the Wendigo appears to them in a dream as well. But it's really interesting that Wendigos were essentially humans at one point who become the embodiment of winter for those indigenous North American communities.
And this sometimes is a reoccurring theme with monsters, that they were once people. Something went wrong, they mentally or physically or in a lab, for instance, and then they turn into monsters, and then they become a legend after that. Have you come across any other stories with those same kind of characteristics of the Wendigo?
Absolutely, in the sense, actually, we can still talk about the Wendigo, and this is a really interesting example of how different communities and cultures can sort of combine lore. So the first written record we have of the Wendigo actually is in the 17th century, with, of course, acknowledging that there were oral traditions long before. But those first Wendigo stories were written down by Jesuit priests, which I say that because they existed in that region because Europeans came to those areas. And when Europeans confronted these legends of the idea of a person who turned into a monster that makes them ravenous for human flesh, they actually made a comparison to werewolf legends. And we see a direct comparison. Actually, one priest literally calls them like veritable werewolves. So even then, we have this idea, this was early 20th century, people trying to compare monsters, which I think is really fascinating, again, to try to make that connection between people. So there are so that's one aspect of, sort of the human changing into a monster, like a werewolf is the obvious example. There's also hyenas, which kind of like the name suggests, similar to the werewolf, only the person becomes a hyena, or actually the hyenas turn into people, which is really fascinating. And then there are lots of different snow monsters or winter monsters across the globe. I'm actually working on an episode about one for next season of Monstrum from Japan called the Yuki Onna. So look forward to that one.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. I'm excited for this new season. It's going to be so cool.
Thank you. I can't believe it's been I can't believe I've been on this journey for that long, to be honest, but there's still so many more monsters to cover. So I don't see us running out of steam anytime soon.
You've done some research into alien greys. First off, what made you want to bring that topic into your research on monster mythology?
So I think part of the reason for that is I have a broader definition of monsters of what maybe some people would have. And I think that the distinction between something like a monster and a cryptid is very vague. So for me, a monster is any entity or being that is seen as deviant in behavior or appearance, and that sort of antisocial behavior is made monstrous or frightening by a series of stories that is told by other people about it. So for me, the greys fit the bill, right? They're considered other, they're considered different from humans, and they scare us, and we have lots of stories about them. So for me, they are very obviously monsters.
And how might the stories of alien greys be important from a literature perspective?
Ooh, great question. I think, and again, this is just my personal approach to literary scholarship. It's not just about the written word. It's about everything that contributed to the writing of those words. So for me, thinking about greys and thinking about extraterrestrials and alien beings of all kinds, I really think it comes from this idea that we want to believe in the unknown. And if we look at how that unknown is interpreted throughout history, we can, again, track sort of different trends in human thought and philosophy. So not necessarily greys, or could be greys, depending on which, sort of extraterrestrial belief you're subscribing to. But even something like Martians, right? We have that idea of the capital M Martian really emerge in the late 19th century. But then following World War I, we see a shift in how those aliens are illustrated and talked about because of different tensions existing during that period. So I think that in a lot of ways, stories about greys, and that's, I guess, what it comes down to, is why are they important to literature? Because they are stories. And again, it's about that narrative element that really makes something a monster. It's not enough for, me to see a shadowy figure across the street and call that a monster in my own head. Someone has to record or transcribe or orally share some kind of narrative about that scary, shadow across the street. And that has to be translated and shared with other people. And it's really, again, that idea of community at the center of horror that I find really fascinating. So if we look at literature as just another way of communities sharing information and sharing stories, then of course, greys are going to be something worth talking about.
You also have an interest in female monsters. Yeah. And this is interesting that you actually highlighted that on your website. Usually when we think of monsters, we think of them of being a bit more male-oriented, aggressive, territorial, and many times even preying specifically on women. We don't usually think of female monsters. Well, of course, there are a few exceptions. So what kind of female monsters have you come across that put a tingle down your spine?
There are so many good ones. Before I answer that part of the question, I do want to say that my fascination with female monsters actually for me is I see them everywhere. And I think part of that is because my research does call for me to go back so far into history, hundreds or sometimes thousands of years. But I think, again, it comes from this idea of so-called deviant behavior and demonizing other people. And if I've learned anything from these 4 seasons of Monstrum and from my work as a monster expert, if you can bet on anything, it's that colonialism and misogyny are going to come into play for monsters, particularly if those monsters are female, which I think says a lot about different kinds of ideas about patriarchal society, essentially. But for me, some of the most fascinating female monsters I've come across are the ones that are very specific. So one of my favorite monsters of all time, because I think she is so creepy and just so fascinating, is the Filipino Manananggal, which is an exclusively female monster who is a self-segmenting vampiric creature. So these monsters will literally separate their upper body from their torso, grow wings, and fly throughout the sky to suck the viscera of their victims with a really long proboscis-like tongue while people sleep at night. And their favorite victims are fetuses. So they actually prey on pregnant women, which of course, once I heard that, I was like, there has to be a story there. And there is. So I think Manananggals are fascinating. As someone of Irish descent, I really like the stories of the Banshee as well. I think that more older historical figures like the Lamia, who was interpreted as Lilith by some communities, and which I think became the succubus and the vampire, is really interesting. But I actually come across more, I would say, female exclusive monsters than male exclusive monsters. Maybe that's because I do look at stuff that's a little more obscure, but I think a lot of the time, at least in this day, in the 21st century, when we see or think of monster, we might think of a masculine figure because those are the more popular stories that we've seen depicted across, our screens of all various kinds and even in the pages of books. But for me, in reality, I think a lot of monsters come from either female voices or from a fear of the female voice.
We have a few minutes left till our next break, but you mentioned the Manananggal, and hopefully I said that right. You said that there's actually a story behind why they like to feast on fetuses, and then you left me hanging.
Sorry, there's just so many interesting things to talk about with monsters. But so when I say that there's a larger story to that, so if we, and again, this is a lot of just breaking. That's essentially what I do, is I try to break down elements of monster stories and that could be potential explanations. Not that my interpretation is the only one, but for me, I read the Manananggal's desire to prey on fetuses and pregnant women in particular in 2 different ways. So one, if we actually look back into pre-colonial Filipino history, there were one of the most important roles in society was that of the sort of shaman or spiritual leader, who also would often serve as a midwife. And of course, women as the ones, when women give birth, there's more of that merging of life and death, of boundaries, of creation. And so I think that naturally the female capacity for reproduction is something that inspired a lot of fear and wonder in equal measure. And so we have these female individuals who are serving these important roles, and then we have the Spanish come in with their ideas of Christianity. And one of the things any kind of conquering people wants to do is try to control. And so one method of control that we see throughout history from any kind of religious group encountering another and trying to repress it in some capacity is taking ideas of existing spiritual practice and folklore and trying to reinterpret those into their own religious philosophies. So with something like the Manananggal, you had maybe where women were prioritized or lauded in some ways, and lauded with their connection to childbirth. So what's one way to maybe make those people seem more subservient or to change their existing perspective in society is to demonize them. So we have this idea that, women are going to come and feed on your babies. So that's sort of one side of the equation. But the other side of the Manananggal for me is really, the stillbirths, miscarriages, any kind of birthing complication or pregnancy complication. There are tons of things that can happen when you're pregnant. And I think that the death of pregnant women and the death of babies when you can't maybe explain that by any scientific or seemingly natural way, again, we make a story to fill in the gap because it makes us feel more in control and maybe gives some kind of relief to those people. So yeah, I think we have both. We have lots of different elements, and that's again just one creature and one monster, and we can break down monsters like that across different communities.
Out of all the ones that I've looked into, that one by far has to be the most terrifying.
Yeah.
It's very scary. And the whole having two halves, the top half, the bottom half, and wings. I mean, yeah, that is pretty darn freaky. But Emily, we are coming towards a break. I have a bunch more questions for you, but hang tight. We'll be right back.
Gigawatt paranormal powerhouse, KUNX-DB, the X.
This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
I want to thank all of you for listening to The X. But did you know you can watch live streaming video and catch your favorite video casts on the UNX Network YouTube channel?
Wow, you mean I can watch the X shows anytime?
That's right. Watch any show, anytime, even binge watch your favorite programs.
Which shows are on the UNX Network YouTube channel?
You can watch Most Haunted with Dan Terry, Entity Voices, Paranormal Evidence, Paranormally Blonde, and Unexplained Phenomena Australia, and many more. Also, be sure and catch live coverage of special events and special broadcasts from the UNX Network.
That's great. I'm going to subscribe to the UNX Network channel right now.
Awesome. You can find everything you need to know about the YouTube channel at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for everything unexplained. It's the new mainstream. It's the UNX Network.
Explaining
The Unexplained.
the new unxnetwork.com.
Are you ready to read about true paranormal events? UNX Media publishes nonfiction books about UFOs, ghosts and haunted places, time anomalies, cryptid creatures, and more. Just like KUNX-DB Radio, it's all about unexplained phenomena. Visit www.unxmedia.com to see our list of great book titles by Debbie Ziegelmeyer, Gene Walker, Devin Listrom, Wayne Lawrence, Bill Spicer, and yours truly, Margie Kay. That's unxmedia.com.
Gold loves chaos, uncertainty, and disarray. History shows us what gold does when people aren't sure about the government, the stock market, their jobs, or their retirement savings. Our national debt is skyrocketing. Gold and other precious metals are a defense measure against inflation and a stock market that might take years to recover. So what can you do right now to protect yourself? Call United Gold Group. We offer gold and other precious metals delivered securely within 72 hours. Are you worried about the stock market? We can also help you set up a real gold or silver IRA or a 401k. Safe and secure. United Gold Group makes gold ownership affordable. Call now and get up to $2,500 in free gold or silver with a qualified IRA. Call 800-753-8534. That's 800-753-8534 or visit unitedgoldgroup.com.
look at monsters, a lot of ways to protect ourselves or to repel these entities is to have salt and iron, and maybe a few other things. Why is that from your research?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I think one easy answer is that they're kind of accessible to a lot of different people, right? Fire is another common thing to destroy monsters, particularly the undead. And again, metal, salt, and fire are relatively obtainable for most of us, at least. So I think there's some reasons there. But if we think from a more, I guess, not elemental level, but of what those things actually do, iron is, cold. It's a strong material. Salt is tangy and can both preserve things, which I think is really interesting. But that's actually a good question. I don't know exactly why salt or iron or fire, other than their accessibility. But as long as you have one of those things on hand, particularly salt, it's also easy to transport, right? That will save you from a lot of things, from Mononongols to evil forces to negative witchcraft. Salt's usually a good thing to have on hand.
I will never go hiking again without a pocket full of salt, just to be safe, because I'm not taking any risks.
I was a Girl Scout at one point, so always be prepared is a philosophy I live by.
You host another show called Fate and Fabled. In one episode, you speak about the Chinnamasta. Who is this goddess?
So Chinnamasta is a Buddhist and Hindu tantric goddess. Her name literally means she who is decapitated. And that's what I think find very interesting about this particular deity is that she cuts off her own head and will, like, in most depictions of her, she's holding it up and there's blood coming from it. And that blood is actually feeding her sort of followers, or actually pouring down on copulating couples, which is really interesting. So Chinnamasta is the sort of self-sacrificing tantric goddess connected to not death, but more so rebirth. And both of those ideas come together with tantric practices, so with a sexual element as well. But Chinnamasta is all about sustenance and, again, about self-control, which I think is really interesting to have a self-decapitating goddess. I mean, that's pretty badass, in my opinion.
It definitely is. When I saw this one, I was like, I've never heard of this. It sounds terrifying, but also like pretty darn cool, but I don't get it. I had all those thoughts and emotions going on at the exact same time when I came across this one. I was like, what?
What's happening? I think that's very natural, because I think when we see decapitation or even hear the word, we automatically have this negative association. And obviously decapitation is nothing fun for any, living human by any means. But I think for me, what I find really interesting about this particular deity is it's the ultimate sacrifice, right? Is giving up your blood, giving up your life. And the idea of blood being both something that can give life, I mean, literally, right? Blood transfusions in a lot of ways, or birth, blood pumping through our bodies keeps us alive. Offering that up is interesting. And then taking that, we usually see blood, negative association because it's being taken, right? There's a death, there's an attack, something like that. So for Chinnamasta to take control over her own body and decapitate herself, because of course it's worth mentioning, she's not considered undead, and she's not necessarily a negative goddess. That act of violence against herself is seen as sort of her mastering complete control over her mind and her body. She essentially can self-decapitate as many times as she wants, which I think is really interesting from a spiritual perspective, because it's literally the antithesis of selfishness. She's transcended all limitations, from hunger to sexual desire, to really sort of give up this part of herself. And so I think that, again, from what I understand about the religious practices in which this goddess serves, it's really about giving yourself away and overcoming any self-doubt, including death.
That is very fascinating. And then you have another type of entity that we just mentioned, the Mononongal, that while it's not necessarily decapitating herself, she is in two halves, but her reason is completely different to this deity that you had just mentioned.
And I think part of that, from my interpretation, is where the body is segmented, right? So the Mononongal is from the torso. So she's essentially removing her head and her upper body from the lower part, which again, if we want to think of childbirth and maybe negative portrayals of women, she's being removed from her capacity to give birth, right? From her sexual origin. Sex organs, which is really interesting. Whereas Chinnamasta, just the head itself, this idea of removing sort of the brain from the rest of the body, to me speaks a little bit more about the idea of separating the mental and the physical that many people tend to do. Whereas Chinnamasta, both of those things are together. She can't, think to self-decapitate without the use of her brain. So I think there's an interesting distinction happening there.
Now, there are monsters that are truly out to kill you and take your life force, while others are just kind of like trickster type entities. Why are these trickster entities loved in ancient times when sometimes their jokes could cause harm?
I think that those kind of trickster deities or trickster monsters, a lot of the time in my mind, are meant to explain natural phenomena and reflect also the human understanding of the world. Outside of human behavior, which we all know can be notoriously tricky, there are, again, unexplained things that animals do, or maybe it's raining but the sun is out, right? We have explanations for these things now, but before, science came into the picture, there were different stories, different narratives that we told to try to make sense of the unpredictability in the world, essentially. And I think that attributing those events to a trickster god is a way to explain the strange, but also a way to connect with our maybe own impishness. I mean, telling jokes or tricking one another can be both harmful or scary. But I think that since we as humans do that, we like to connect to maybe a deity that does so as well. I also think that tricksters establish social norms, right? So the tricks that they're playing are tricks because they're viewed in a certain way, right? So maybe something like the Chinese Monkey King, who, is punished for stealing the peaches he was meant to be, safeguarding. That obviously could be about teaching people not to steal things. And I think that's just one thing that trickster gods and monsters do.
And trickster gods are a universal thing. I mean, in every single culture, you're going to come across them. What kind of trickster entities have you personally come across that you were like, whoa, this is interesting?
The one that pops into mind for me would be the Kokopelli. As someone who's located in Arizona and who grew up here as a child, Kokopelli are everywhere. And Kokopelli was something I didn't know until I was older, are actually fertility deities, in addition to being tricksters. And I think that even with more popular figures, or not popular, but maybe more European figures like the Norse Loki, right? We have this idea of trickery and fertility coming into play, which I think is really, really interesting. But for me, again, I think that trickster gods are mostly just about unpredictability, and things like creating life can be like that. But yeah, I think that we have trickster gods, not just because of unpredictability, but because we as humans make mistakes, and that if we're trying to learn from those mistakes through a story, or we're trying to police and stop people from making those mistakes, having some kind of, funny trickster figure who doesn't fit easily into the good or evil box is a really helpful device.
Well, one thing that is not a mistake is playing Christmas music on November 1st, all the way until Christmas. And, when you walk into any store right now, you hear Christmas music. All the decorations are on display, ready to be bought. Even the chocolate in the candy aisle is already, and it's already festive wrapping. Okay. And while
too soon after spooky season, not a fan.
I know. Me neither. And while so many children wait for Santa Claus to come down their chimney on Christmas, what about Krampus? Who is he?
Krampus. So Krampus is really more of a category of monster than the name of an individual creature. Krampus is more like a wintertime boogeyman that was used to threaten children in the Alpine region of Europe. And over time, that sort of larger boogeyman figure started taking on physical characteristics that were really specific because people started wearing costumes to evoke this monster, which gave them more standardized features. And some of those features and costumes included horns, but you can't have a Krampus without a birch whip, basically, because that's one of the things he does. Krampus became the dark foil to Saint Nicholas around the 17th century. So in today's modern era, a lot of people conceptualize Krampus as being the anti-Santa. Well, beforehand, he was part of broader folklore, not directly connected to Christmas at any point, and there's lots of reasons for that, which I talk about in the Monstrum episode. But essentially, I think Krampus is, I guess, in some ways like the Wendigo, because Krampus can be someone that steals children to eat them, right? There's this idea of this scary winter monster. And so Krampus is in some ways the Alpine version of scary scary winter monsters. So I think if we are tracing back the history of Krampus, most scholars, myself included, believe that that sort of boogeyman figure was inspired by the Perchten, which are a broader, mysterious Alpine spirits, particularly popular in Austrian folk tradition. And those particular spirits were associated with winter months, with like scarcity, and with the idea of trying to appease the Perchten and Frau Perchta, which is actually the female deity that comes from, with this idea of being generous. If you left out food, you would be rewarded. And if you didn't, Frau Perchten would slit your stomach open and replace your intestines with trash, as one does. So if we're looking at winter monsters in general, I think the idea of scarcity, both of like food and clothing and shelter in the winter months, comes into play. And a lot of the time, the winter monsters are about sharing resources in the community or preparing adequately for winter so that you don't become victim to this monster or to like the real threatening elements of winter. And like I said, anti-Santa, this idea of Krampus connected to Santa goes back to Saint Nicholas, although no one's really sure exactly why or when this more boogeyman type figure became associated with that. But we can connect. There's a play actually that connects the Krampus figure with Satan. So of course, again, we love a good dichotomy. So if we have, the devil type winter creature, and then we have the literal saintly winter creature, we got to have that sort of tension between the two. So that's one of the ways in which Krampus became sort of the negative version of Santa.
And with Krampus, nobody is safe. No matter if you're a child or an adult, everyone can be his victim.
Yep, just like the Icelandic Yule cat, which again is another Yuletide winter monster who is, as the name suggests, a giant, like house-sized cat that goes around killing anyone who doesn't receive new clothing by Christmas, which again, I think speaks very clearly to making sure people have enough clothes and to be grateful if you even get clothes as a present, right? Because you want to stay warm in winter. So I think the idea of seasonal monsters is really fascinating. And Krampus and the Yule cat are just two examples.
I think I'd be really excited to see a ginormous cat. I just want to like pet it and love it and like.
It'd be cute in theory, but then we know cats are notoriously finicky and at least for me, I think judgy. So I don't trust the cat. So you know how it is. 1 minute they're purring, the next they're trying to swipe you with their claws. And I think that kind of, I guess, going back to that idea of the trickster entity, right? This idea that it could be good or bad, positive or negative, is something that we like to make stories about.
And in one episode of Fate and Fabled, you actually talk about cats in mythology. And there's one question that your other host asked, and that was, what does our fascination with cats say about human nature? No, I think you asked that question. So what's the answer to that?
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Dr. Moya McTeer or myself, but I think I'm fascinated by mythologies that are focused around one particular type of animal, and cats is definitely one of them. So why cats? I think cats, part of it comes, like we were just talking about, from their sort of notoriously finicky and nature. I think that there's, that saying, of course, that we've domesticated dogs, but cats have domesticated us. So I think part of the fascination with cats is not only in how they look and sort of like their beauty, their regalness, how they hold themselves, but also a little bit in their practical purpose, right? Cats were kept around, and still are to this day, but particularly in other historical periods, as ways to keep vermin out, right? They served a very practical purpose. Not to say that other other animals don't serve practical purposes, but there's something very elusive and mysterious about cats, and they're quiet. They sort of have different physical characteristics and personality traits that I think different cultures across the globe really thought were interesting in their uniqueness. And so in turn wanted to make the cat figure itself unique in some of the mythology and folklore that we tell about those creatures.
I'm personally a huge cat person. So like a cat could literally scratch me and hurt me and I'd be like, it's okay, I still love you. I love you wholeheartedly.
Exactly. I'm a bird person myself. So I have a cockatiel, but again, I think this is about certain kinds of animals. There's like a lot of folklore mythology around different types of birds, right? Like the peacock, because of its physical characteristics, making it different. Or about ravens or crows, because again, they're sort of unique in that they're all black and they are very intelligent. So monsters, again, aren't just based on human behaviors. We have animal behaviors and also other natural elements like the wind, the rain, rivers, oceans, like we were talking about. And so I just think it's another example of how we pull monsters from all different kinds of inspirations in our world, which to me, again, only proves that monsters are part of who we are as humans, that we are human because we make monsters.
That's really interesting, because usually when you think of monsters, you wouldn't put the two and two together. But so far with the conversation that we've had, I can see those two like working together. Mm-hmm. You've done videos, presentations, and have even written articles about dragons.
Yes.
What is their appeal globally, in your opinion?
Well, I think this is coming from what we were just talking about, right? I think the dragon combines animal features with those sort of different parts of nature as well. So I think that we believe in dragons, we want to believe in dragons because they represent the power of nature and our inability to control it. I mean, in all the stories that we have, at least that I've encountered about different kinds of dragons, yes, maybe you can defeat them. Maybe you might be able to train them, like the famous movie, right? But dragons are inherently wild animals in all of the depictions that we see them in. They are unable to be controlled. And I think that if we look at the characteristics of dragons, that becomes very obvious. The why for that is because they resemble real predatory animals that exist in the world. So I think that partially we can explain dragons in essentially two ways. One is in living animals that were threats to humans and are still threats to humans, things like tigers and bears and birds of prey, right? Where we have this idea of the wings and the large talons and the big teeth. But also we can't talk about dragons and not talk about fossils. There's definitely some evidence that at least some people encountered fossilized remains of different kinds of creatures, both prehistoric and less separated from us in terms of chronological time, and not knowing how to explain like a giant skull in the ground full of really sharp teeth, we create a story to explain that. And I think that dragons are meant to be, or specifically for me, tied to nature in particular, and about natural elements and those various predatory animals becoming sort of conglomerated into an even bigger fear.
So then, do you think that the legends of dragons came from fossils that were found?
I think, again, that's part of an explanation. I don't think that's the full explanation. And again, I think that's one thing to keep in mind with monsters in general, is that there's rarely going to be one like pinpoint that we can look at and say, like, that's the thing that created the monster. There's very few instances of that. And so I think, again, fossils are part of it, but not the only explanation. And I think a good example of that would particularly be the Chinese dragon, which I think is one of the most beautiful interpretations of dragons. The Chinese dragon can shapeshift, and they are capable of great intelligence. They're both destructive, but also revered as deities. They're symbols of luck and prosperity. They're tied to, different kinds of politics in Chinese history as well. And I think that what's really interesting about the Chinese dragon too is that it combines those different animals very clearly. Like the Chinese dragon can literally be broken down into different parts. So borrowing their head from the shape of a camel, the antlers from a stag, the body of a snake. So what the Chinese dragon does that I think is really beautiful is it breaks down, or maybe makes a little more obvious, some of the other interpretations of dragons that we see across the world as well.
Emily, I have one final question for you. As someone who loves horror, I have to ask, what is your favorite scary movie? And
oh my gosh.
But here's the thing. And what elements does it need to have to be scary in your opinion? Does it need to have jump scares or like the emotional fears of like loss or gory scenes?
Yeah. Oh, so that's such a good question. It's so hard because my first instinct is like, okay, well, what kind of horror movie? Are we talking slasher? Are we talking, thriller? But if I had to pick, I will go with top three. My top three current favorite scary movies would be the original Halloween. It was the first slasher film I ever saw. It's a classic. Also, I really love Scream. And then Train to Busan. Those are probably my top three at the moment. But all of the horror movies that I really enjoy, to get back to your question, they're scary. To me, it's never about the monster or even, the serial killer or, demonic presence coming after you. It's about the living human reaction to that scary thing and to one another that I think is the more interesting element. And I think all three of those movies do that really well. So jump scares help, don't get me wrong. Creative cinematography, I love in a good horror movie, but I think that the best horror stories, if they're on screen or they're written down or they're told orally, are ones that we want to hear over and over again. And I think that desire for repetition in horror really is about us wanting to understand the unknown and to try to get a better grasp of the real things that scare us in the world by using these fictional texts as sort of exercises, which is something I do. I think horror is instructive. So for me, when I watch a horror movie, it's not just about being entertained. It's what I can learn from that horror movie. If that's, to never go into the basement by myself, or to have some salt on hand, or to honestly check your back seat of your car before getting into it. I think that horror is fun and educational and exciting.
Emily, thank you so much for being on Shifting the Paradigm. Where can people find you online to stay up to date with all of your research?
So to stay up to date with what I'm doing and with my projects with PBS like Monstrum and Fate and Fabled, you can find me on Twitter at Zarka Emily, and also on my website, emilyelizabethzarka.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to the UNX Network, KUNX-DB, Kansas City, Missouri.
It was an absolute pleasure to speak with Dr. Zarka and talk about everything Monstrum related. All of her social media links and her Monstrum show are below. Check out my website at strangeparadigms.com for all show archives in podcast and video formats, along with my social media links such as Discord, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and more. Follow me on Twitter at eyes_on_the_skies for all of my updates and news. I want to wish you all a wonderful week. Please like this video or podcast on your platform of choice and share it with those who have the same interest. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a lot more great shows coming to you soon. Be safe, and remember, keep your eyes on the skies.